Quer desenvolver os talentos da sua equipe e potencializar os resultados da sua empresa? Conte com a expertise do atendimento corporativo do Senac São Paulo, que já capacitou mais de 1 milhão de pessoas e profissionais de instituições públicas, privadas e terceiro setor. Construa uma equipe altamente motivada e capacitada e destaque-se no mercado. Entre em contato, acesse sp.senac.br/corporativo e saiba mais. Quer saber? Senac.
August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. Over the weekend, Donald Trump did a long interview on Fox News in which he flatly declared he had a right to interfere in the last presidential election. He also mused aloud that God may have selected him to fix what he called our sick country, and said that we have an enemy within that's out to get him. It's all unhinged, vile stuff, and it gets at a bigger story. With 2 months to go before the election, Trump continues to speak almost exclusively to his MAGA audience and to its various pathologies. Ann Lutz-Fernandez, a writer on politics and education, has a good new piece at the Unpopulist website about MAGA, in particular its shrinking obsessions and its escalating self-radicalization. So we invited her on to talk about how Trump is communicating with MAGA these days. Welcome, Ann.
Hi, great to talk to you, Greg.
So Trump did this long interview on Fox News with a very friendly host, Mark Levin. Let's start with what he said about his attempt to overturn the 2020 election.
Whoever heard you get indicted for interfering with a presidential election where you have every right to do it? You get indicted and your poll numbers go up.
And I want to pick up on a line from your piece. You write that Trump's MAGA movement does not even seek to represent a majority of the country. Listening to that quote, I think a lot of people won't grasp that Trump is really saying that January 6th was good, that he had every right to use his power to prevent a majority of the country from picking a president that MAGA didn't want. Can you talk about that element of the MAGA worldview?
The MAGA worldview has been an ethno-nationalism that has sought to vilify anyone outside of a certain ideal, and that ideal being a white Christian male, native-born and English-speaking. And Trump has campaigned for the last decade on the notion that he is there to protect that subgroup of Americans from the threat from immigrants, but also the threat from other groups within the country that he doesn't see and MAGA doesn't seem to see as true Americans. So the notion that January 6th then becomes a fight on behalf of that group and attains its credibility and its validity because it's fighting for this shrunken vision of America.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way our national reckoning over January 6th has never really grappled with the white nationalist and white supremacist elements in it. To pick up on your point, white power movements were represented at the Capitol that day in a big way. And to your point about MAGA essentially dismissing the legitimacy of everyone outside of it, the primary fake justification for overturning the election was allegations of rampant voter fraud by undocumented immigrants and dwellers in swing state urban centers like Philadelphia and Milwaukee. In other words, the supposed injustice inflicted on Trump and MAGA was largely by this kind of non-MAGA, largely non-white population. And that, to me, really is what makes your point about MAGA being driven by a shrinking definition of who counts as a real American important. I mean, those two things are connected, right? This definition of what a real American is and this kind of mythologizing of January 6th?
Absolutely. If the notion is that these votes that were not for Trump but for Biden are invalidated on the basis that they were votes that came from these groups outside of MAGA, then it is not a legitimate election.
Right, by definition. Let's go to a second Trump quote on Fox News. Here's how Trump talked about the ongoing prosecutions of him, which we will remind listeners are for allegedly stealing important national security secrets and trying to sabotage and destroy American democracy with mob violence.
We have the enemy outside, which would be the very standard countries, and we have the enemy from within. We have some very sick people from within. I think that the people that go around indicting their political opponent, especially when their political opponent didn't want to do it to them, I could have done it so easy.
So, Anne, Trump is basically saying that the law cannot be applied legitimately to Trump and his movement. Anyone who does this, tries to apply the law to them, is an enemy within. He'd also pardon the January 6 rioters who violently attacked the government, calls them patriots and heroes. Again, to MAGA, January 6th was a heroic stand. Can I ask, to what degree is this kind of explicit declaration of being above the law, of being a fundamentally lawless movement, also central to MAGA ideology?
Well, I suppose the notion that the law is in Trump, right, is
Yes.
the ultimate permission structure for anything he says, right? If he can never be wrong, if he is the law, if there is no law outside of him, then you must be with him, right? To be forgiven for what that old set of laws that no longer apply. You want to be with Trump then, and to follow his lead, to know what is right and what is just, and that the rule of law, as we've known it now for a couple of centuries, is something that he has been working to undermine, as we know, for the last decade, and has become much more explicit as the years have gone on, and even in these last couple of comments, much more explicit about who the enemy is and who it is not.
Yeah, and clearly this description of law enforcement officials as well as court officials and judges and the like as an enemy is also about laying a fake pretext to undertake lawless prosecutions against MAGA's enemies later if he wins, which he has explicitly said he will do, and is clearly part of his appeal to MAGA. Can I ask, isn't that sort of yet another manifestation of what you're talking about here, which is this kind of creation of a MAGA core that can essentially recast the law entirely around itself and kind of go after its enemies with pretty much carte blanche? I mean, it seems to me that that's also central to MAGA, this threat to prosecute non-MAGA America, basically.
And I think, what you've pinpointed is the escalation from what was really an identity-based approach, right? That MAGA was an identity, that following Trump was an identity. But now Trump is saying something closer to that it's not just an identity. It is not just a way of thinking of yourself or seeing yourself, but it is also, again, a permission structure for behavior that would otherwise be viewed as traitorous or illegal or dangerous.
And targeting the quote-unquote enemy with abandon, right?
And it's because the enemy is both without and within that permission to lawlessness becomes so especially dangerous and pervasive and hard to predict.
Yeah, I want to go to something you wrote in your piece about Tim Walz, and I think there's a big through line here. You write that for Trump and MAGA, Tim Walz's career in public service and his 2 decades in the National Guard simply don't count because he's against MAGA. There's even a through line here to the Arlington scandal, which all of you have followed. We have a podcast on that from last week. Please check that out. In which Trump's thugs have smeared the Arlington official who tried to prevent their unlawful campaign activities there in the most vile terms imaginable. So, Anne, is this the core idea that for Trump and MAGA, public service is simply not a thing to venerate unless Trump and MAGA are the beneficiaries? If not, the public servants are just the enemy. There are only friends of Trump and MAGA or enemies of Trump and MAGA. No such thing as honorable service to the nation. Right? Isn't that the core worldview here in a nutshell?
Yes, and when we think of the history of, there has been a history of denigrating public service over the past several decades. The notion of the lazy federal employee or the teacher with summers off. This notion that there are government workers who are taking advantage of living off the taxpayer dime is something we've been hearing for a long time. But with Trump and MAGA, we're seeing something that I feel like is quite an escalation of that denigration of public service to presenting public servants not as simply someone who is benefiting from public largesse, but somebody who is sinister and insidious and part of this mysterious deep state. I'm a former educator. Teachers, public school teachers are being presented as indoctrinators and leftist Marxists. And then we have, all the way up to the Department of Justice. And as you mentioned, judges and prosecutors being presented as some kind of agents of political vengeance and a political will, because it's directed at Trump and because it's directed at his followers, at least those who have followed him into insurrection, is quite an escalation. And I found it fascinating to see how that was playing out in the attacks on Walz.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, there's another through line here to January 6th as well, because another big target of MAGA in the public service realm is elections officials. So when Donald Trump called up, or one of the top election officials in Georgia, and said, find me 11,000 votes, i.e., help me cheat in the election, and that man refused, he was endlessly vilified by MAGA, again as the enemy, simply because he didn't put MAGA and Trump above the law. And I mean, that's the through line here. There's no service to the nation. There's only service to MAGA, or you're the enemy.
Absolutely. And so, we saw over the course of Trump's first and hopefully only administration, his attacks on soldiers and military officials who he deemed not worthy of respect by virtue of their military service. And so to see that playing out so quickly and immediately with Tim Walz was a reminder that it's not just an ethno-nationalism anymore. But there's a growing list of people who are the enemy within. There's a growing list of people who we should be suspicious of on the basis of their lack of fealty to Trump, or simply by other identity markers that we would have, for example, like military service, that we would have in the past have seen as inoculating someone from these kinds of attacks.
Okay, so let's go to another Trump quote on Fox. He said,
and I'd like to think that God thinks that I'm going to straighten out our country. Our country is so sick. And it's so broken. Our country is just broken.
Here, again, he's speaking very directly to MAGA obsessions, the view that our country is in profound trouble, that's sliding into full-blown catastrophe. And I want to ask about another element of MAGA, which is the Christian nationalist and evangelical strains to it. Why is all this catastrophizing so central to the MAGA understanding of the country?
Well, I think the embrace of Trump of Christian identity has been really one of the primary ways he's sought to inoculate himself, right? And so, yes, he's a white man, but he was from New York City, right? He was an elite. He had several identity markers going into his political career that were not consistent with a Christian ideal. And so that embrace of his Christian identity has been so important to making groups that would otherwise find offensive some of his positions and language embracing of his rule.
Yeah, and by the way, again, there's a Christian nationalist and evangelical element to January 6th as well, in which Christian nationalists see January 6th as a kind of last stand against the country's sliding into secular ruin. And again, what's amazing to me is how skillfully Trump speaks to these types of impulses and ideologies. You listen to an interview like this on Fox, and he just sounds like a rambling lunatic a lot of the time. And he's clearly temperamentally and psychologically unfit to run the country. The sentiments themselves are deeply deranged and in many ways contrary to the American spirit. But at the same time, they're sort of so weirdly and perfectly targeted to his MAGA audience. I don't know how to account for that. Do you?
Well, I do think that I personally, as a former teacher of rhetoric, I underestimated his rhetorical ability in his early years. And yes, I mean, often you would read a speech or hear a speech and think, well, this makes a fine postmodernist poem because it is so fragmented that it's hard to make sense of it. And I need to spend, the time a literary scholar would spend with something really difficult to really understand what he's saying. But he does understand the power of particular words. And so that last quote that you mentioned, the word sick is a very powerful word that has so many meanings. And particularly as the MAGA movement and the QAnon movement have been so focused on issues around pedophilia and issues around sexual deviance and issues that relate to sexuality. I find that word to be a fascinating word that suggests, as you mentioned, something unchristian and beyond secular, but in fact perverted and dangerous.
I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, he's a great communicator in his own profoundly twisted way. Ann Lutz Fernandez, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Folks, please make sure to check out some new content we have up at TNR.com. Jason Lincoln's looking at how Kamala Harris's policies are essentially held up by the Supreme Court right now, and Timothy Noah arguing that Labor's next big moment may finally be at hand. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.